Okay, team. It looks like critical analysis is back on the menu. Good evening, everyone. My name is Celeste La Cabra. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here and you are a fan of in-depth analyses on films and you'd like to talk about cult and art house cinema, please consider go ahead and hitting that subscribe button. And also please like the video and leave me lovely comments to read. That would be very much appreciated. Next, I want to thank my partner Avery, who really helped me flesh out a lot of these ideas that I'm about to put forward. For whatever reason, I had a really hard time kind of articulating my criticisms of the film, and talking it out with her and getting her input on everything was actually extremely helpful for me. So I want to give her like a little co-writer credit or whatever, and just thank her for her help. And then my last disclaimer before we go ahead and get started is that I'm going to spoil the shit out of this. So if you have not seen the menu and you care about spoilers, then please do me a favor and add this to your watch later playlist. Go watch the film and then come back and we can hang out. But if you've already seen the film or if you just don't care about spoilers, then let's proceed. So let's go ahead and start with like a general plot synopsis. So foodie Tyler and his date Margot arrive at a private island to dine at an exclusive high-end restaurant that is basically only visited by the snooty upper crust of society. There, the ominous and brilliant head chef Julian Slowick commands his immaculately trained kitchen staff with military-like devotion and efficiency. He reveals that each course of the night's menu will have a theme that will coalesce at the end, and as the dishes are revealed, they quickly become more and more personal, unsettling, and completely unhinged before peaking in the sous chef's public suicide. It is then revealed that the entirety of the staff and guests will be dead by the end of the night. Julian immediately realizes that Margot is not meant to be there, and she reveals to him that she is a hired sex worker. He entrusts her to fetch a large barrel of ingredients for the dessert. Ingredients? And while in Julian's home, she finds photographs throughout his career, including an early Employee of the Month award at an ordinary burger joint. She utilizes this knowledge to request a cheeseburger and fries from him, which ends up being a moment of connection that saves her life. As she rides away in a boat, she looks back and sees that Julian has blown up the restaurant, killing everyone inside. Okay, so the first aspect of this film that I really want to dig deep on is the way it portrays the ignorance and exploitation of wealthy elites. The guests on the island are portrayed as comically ignorant, pretentious, and rude. For example, when one of the staff comes up to Tyler and immediately knows his name, it is very obvious that he does not even care to learn the staff member's name. And when he's called on this by Margot, he scoffs at her as though the mere idea of learning a servant's name is a personal affront to him. Throughout the film, the diners have no independent thoughts or opinions, and everything is motivated either by the desire to impress or to place themselves above another person. This characterization of this class and type of people is so obnoxious and on the nose that it becomes kind of eye-rollingly obvious what point is being made, but the tone drastically shifts upon the sous chef's suicide and to me becomes a lot more interesting. So the next theme I want to explore is sort of how these people, at least to Julian and I think to the film as well, represent a kind of bastardization of an artful craft. So whereas Julian views food as an experience meant to be respected and savored in a manner that is mindful, purposeful, and thoughtful, the guests are only interested in taking pictures, criticizing, posturing, or eating. They don't care about the intention behind the dishes, nor do they respect the craft that goes into their creation. Those who pretend to care simply ape whatever the chef is saying or dismiss the whole fare as pretentious and pointless. Tyler is the most knowledgeable of the group and worships at the altar of Julian and his cooking philosophy. However, when given the opportunity to cook a meal in front of him, it is abundantly clear that he doesn't know shit. Tyler thinks he can memorize his way into a true passion and understanding of Julian's genius, but his approach to cooking is devoid of love, soul, and creativity. To Tyler, food appreciation is just intellectual masturbation and posturing to put himself above people he considers to be beneath him. Julian clocks this instantly and thus uses the cooking demonstration as an opportunity to humiliate him. He then instructs Tyler to go hang himself and in his simp-like devotion and inability to think for himself, he does. Julian sees this entire class of foodie, the ultra-wealthy one-percenters that can actually afford to patron his restaurant, as an affront to the entire culinary art form. He views the situation as being so dire that death is the only appropriate punishment. The next theme that I'd like to explore is the loss of passion that Julian experiences. While before Julian had created delicious food for people who are part of his class and actually benefit from and appreciate it when he was working at a burger joint, lately he is creating extremely high-skilled dishes for people who do not understand or appreciate them. They simply care for status and wealth, and even the repeat customers cannot name a single dish they were served over the years. His talent and his gift is honestly just wasted on them. While his previous clientele might not have known the intricacies of the culinary arts, they were at least honest. They truly loved a dish or they didn't, and they would tell you. Margot realizes this innate desire within Julian to create dishes for people who actually care, and realizes that it's been missing, and finds a point of solidarity to break through the theater and pretension to forge a real human moment of relatability. Momentarily, the passion inside him reignites with the flame, cooking his one last cheeseburger. Now, I had to think about this for a while as to whether or not this was a contradiction in his personality, but I think that I've decided that he doesn't necessarily want to go back to cooking in grease traps, as even at the end of the film, right before he lights the bomb or whatever, he sneers at the pedestrian food that is s'mores and the affront to the culinary arts that it represents, which of course is an example of ordinary people food or lower class food. He longs for a space where he can craft high art dishes for people who will appreciate, respect, and understand them. The next theme I'd like to explore is the camaraderie and solidarity found between the members of the servile class. The staff at the restaurant are behind Julian 100%. They are quite literally ride or die for him. They are advocates and progenitors of his cause and have the action to back it up. They have been promised a life of fulfillment, passion, art, and status, and have discovered that these ambitions are simply lies. They are still the servant class, despite the aura of respect and prestige that they promote and embody. At the end of the day, they exist only to serve rich people who do not give a shit about them. This mirrors the lies of the American dream and of capitalism itself. Like the sous chef, many people realize that their hard work and innate talents have a ceiling of success and that they will never achieve their dreams. Now, capitalist ethos dictates that this is a personal and even moral failing. Like the sous chef, many people's grappling with this cruel philosophy and its implications end in suicide. Not only do the staff follow Julian's lead, but they are active participants in the creation of the menu. One cook reveals that she initially pitched the idea to kill everyone, and the sous chef's dish and suicide spectacle are all a product of his creation. In one scene, Julian takes full public accountability for his misuse of power and sexual indiscretion. He allows his victim to publicly expose him and stab him in the thigh. He recognizes his betrayal of his comrades and chooses to attempt to right his own wrongs. Furthermore, Julian spots Margot's working class life and background immediately. He doesn't have to ask or investigate. He really just knows already. He then tests her by asking her to pick a side, the oppressed or the oppressors. Margot is the only one who lives because she's the only one who is a part of the circle of trust that Julian views the working class to inherently share. He sees her taking on this date with Tyler as a job required of a service worker rather than a true act of class betrayal. So this is where it gets a bit tricky. I want to talk about the implications, at least the moral implications, of dying and killing for a political cause as Julian does. Does Julian acting on his cause in this way even make any sense? Now, to me, I think it's pretty obvious that Julian could simply retire or move from this clientele to a more upscale but still accessible restaurant that he could easily open and control. He seems famous and capable enough to be a catalyst for change in the industry. Perhaps he wouldn't change everything overnight, but he could certainly change his own relationship to food and his customers. But it's clear that for whatever reason, these options aren't sufficient. He employs the nuclear option and kills everyone, including his entire staff. The staff seem to consent to this and even show some enthusiasm for it, but that is clearly questionable. Is Julian really the monk-style, self-immolating revolutionary he seems to view himself as, or is he more like a Jim Jones-style cult leader? The staff seem to consent to this, but we have ample examples from history of the power of cults' ability to brainwash their members. Julian has access and control over every aspect of their lives and works them from dawn to dusk, all these people know is filtered through his approval and his worldview. So, in my opinion, while Julian is grounded in good class solidarity and violent spite for the parasitic bourgeois class, he's ultimately a misguided villain. I think it's clear that this is not a desperate crying for help from poor people for whom violence is the only option that they have left. This is rather an incredibly privileged group of alienated wealthy servants choosing to make a horrific and violent statement that won't even survive the flames and the rubble of the explosion that they cause. No one will know why they did this when they discover the wreckage. Margot was the only one who could even conceivably relay his ideas to the outside world, and she wasn't even initially meant to survive. The film clearly wants to be class conscious and be a send-up of wealthy elites, but it seems to put all of its eggs in the basket of an irrational, self-destructive terrorist. The last theme I'd like to really explore is the way that the film satirizes foodies. Now, for full disclosure, I don't know anything about this culture, and as an ethical vegan, I'm almost by definition boxed out of it, and my relationship to food and appreciation of food resides in completely different scenes and circles. To me, the film clearly seems to sit in judgment at those who treat food as an intellectual exercise or strictly an exercise in taste. It seems to assert that food that leaves you hungry is useless and a product of capitalist elite excess. We can really see this the most in Margot's speech calling Julian out, being like, I'm still fucking hungry, you know? Like, that is the primary point of eating, is to satiate you, at least in the eyes of the filmmakers. Seems to me to be a manifesto for quote-unquote poor people food or regular food or working class food or low class food, whatever you want to call it. Burgers and fries, essentially, as opposed to foamy 50-calorie whatever. Now, this is typically a conservative framework. I think of Paul Joseph Watson going to like a snooty liberal restaurant and being upset that the meal he paid for wouldn't satisfy a working man at the end of the day or whatever. But what I find interesting is that the film kind of flips this and uses regular food as representative of the working class versus the food of the bourgeoisie. I think it's an interesting metaphor, and I think that there is something there, but I don't know that I necessarily agree. I think it can be both. Like, food is at its core a matter of practicality, and there is a way to combine the two and create food that is artful, creative, and filling. But even so, I don't really see anything wrong with creating the type of foods portrayed in the film that are strictly exercises in aesthetics, taste, and creativity. The culture surrounding food criticism is certainly problematic, at least as how it's portrayed in the film, but this strikes me more as a malady of the culture surrounding the practice rather than the practice itself. In other words, I can envision a restaurant that serves hyper-artistic, intellectual, less than 50-calorie dishes that is accessible to regular people that choose to indulge. For example, one could likely concoct a litany of criticisms of opera culture or classical music culture. Like in the film, these art forms are pretty much always supported, operated, and attended by very wealthy people. The insular and challenging nature of the art itself also creates a level of inaccessibility that the cost exacerbates. However, this does not inherently mean that opera or classical are exclusively bourgeois art forms. One could easily imagine a competent and thoughtful opera being put on and hosted by a small theater. So to kind of move on to my overall thoughts and my final score, at the end of the day, the film is just immensely gripping and entertaining, and it's obvious why it's been so successful. The performances are all bangers, the score from Colin Stetson is immaculate, and the cinematography and editing are all very slick and effective. The meal course structure is also incredibly effective, with each course escalating and leaving you at the edge of your seat for whatever heinous thing is about to come next. It took me a long time to put my finger on precisely why the film's thematic elements don't work for me, but the way I see it, there are kind of two interpretations of the film that you could go with, both of which don't work for me for different reasons. The first is that Julian is genuinely acting out of ideological motivations, and the film wants to make a statement largely in agreement with him. This is the interpretation that I have seen the most often from people who have seen the film. But the second is that the politics are simply window dressing, and this is a portrait of an insane man with a personal vendetta. Now, this first interpretation doesn't work for me because I don't feel that the film gives us enough information to truly understand Julian or his staff's motivations. We can read into his alienation and his anger, and I've attempted to do that here, but there's clearly something more that would prompt such extreme action. The audience is either expected to fill in the gaps ourselves or accept that these reasons alone are sufficient for his actions. And I just don't. Like I said earlier, there are solutions to these problems that a person of his privilege has available to him that don't involve wanton murder. No one is making him cook there, and he has enough pull to change things, at least for himself. Clearly there is also some self-hatred and projection on his part that informs his actions, but again, we aren't given enough of his character to fully understand this, and especially not enough to understand his staff. The second interpretation doesn't really work for me, primarily because I think it's so much less interesting, but also because this turns the film into a pretty shallow and irresponsible one that paints leftist ideas as inherently prone to senseless violence and spite. It's also pretty obvious to me that this is not what the filmmakers think they're achieving, and it's clear to me that they're largely on Julian's side, at least in his political convictions. While Julian's grievances are understandable, they're simply not proportionate to the actions he takes. Rather than a larger class consciousness and attack on the ruling class, Julian's rage and alienation seems to be specifically tied to the culinary arts and industry, and even more specifically to his restaurant. He doesn't have higher ambitions of starting a revolution or extrapolating these ideas to other industries or even the rest of the high dining industry. As his grievances currently stand, they would more appropriately inform a general alienation, abandoning of the industry, or a public screed. Killing his guests and his staff takes him into the territory of an insane, irrational, and self-destructive leftist terrorist stereotype that we see in so many other films. To me, this ironically works to serve anti-leftist ideas, despite the film clearly thinking that it does the opposite. And to kind of return to my question earlier, I think that Julian definitely reads more like a spiteful cult leader than a genuine revolutionary. And I simply just don't think that the film is as socially conscious as it clearly thinks that it is. Finally, and what maybe is the core of my issue, the film sacrifices the depth of its most interesting character, which is Julian, to focus on Margot, being the audience stand-in. Now, this framing is very effective in creating great suspense, but to me, Margot is honestly just so much less interesting. I would have preferred a narrative that met in the middle, allowing us the suspense while still deeply exploring our anti-hero slash villain. But at the end of the day, like I said, it is a very effective kind of horror comedy thriller type of thing. And it's very well made. I just don't think it's quite there in terms of its writing or its themes. So I would give it a 7 out of 10, and I do recommend checking it out. So I guess you could say that the film bit off more than it could chew. Sorry. Okay, that's the end of my analysis. I do hope you enjoyed this. This one was a little bit more work than usual, but I think it was worth it. So like I said at the beginning, if this sort of in-depth type of discussion on films is something that you're interested in, please go ahead and click the subscribe button and be a part of our gay little film club. Liking the video helps me out in the algorithm, and I love reading you all's lovely comments. I pride myself on fostering a kind, inclusive, and thoughtful community here on YouTube, so comments that are in line with those values are greatly appreciated. There's links in the description to my social media accounts should you like to be a little bit more intimate with me, and there's going to be a screen that pops up pretty soon that will take you to the rest of my film analysis videos, so I will see you there. Until then, hail Anya Taylor-Joy, and hail Satan.